Carla Cox, PhD, RDN, is a diabetes care and education specialist and a pump trainer in a pediatric endocrinology office. She's attended multiple diabetes camps each summer for over 30 years and has written the technology tip sheets for pumps and sensors for the American Diabetes Association. She recently completed the update as the lead author on the pediatric position paper for the Association of Diabetes Care and Education Specialists. So please join me in welcoming Carla to present today. We are so looking forward to having you, and I will go ahead and pass it over to you.
Great. I'm absolutely delighted to be here. I lived in Missoula, Montana, worked at Providence in the Diabetes Center for over 30 years, and was also worked a lot with Marcy Butcher and Linda Simon as we created some of the school documents you may still be using. Moved to Utah about 6 years ago to be with family. So I'm down here working instead, but we were in Missoula for a long time. So what we're going to try and do today is talk about pumps go to school. And as you know, there's a new wave of automated insulin delivery systems, and I'm hoping almost every student that you have that has type 1 diabetes has the opportunity to have if they so choose. So we're going to talk today about understanding the role the automated insulin delivery systems have in managing diabetes. We're going to talk about kind of the algorithms. We need to be able to recognize the different systems and how they work, as you'll have kids on every one of the systems, I'm sure, and know what adjustments can be made to the system to enhance the safety of the child or adolescent at school. And those are things, obviously, to have a conversation with the family, but these are things that you can alter in some of these systems. So we're going to talk about that. Next slide. So these are all out there right now. The first four, the Tandem with Control IQ, and by the way, it's also added the Mobi, which is the cutest little 2-inch insulin pump, all controlled by a cell phone. It's adorable. But anyway, it's part of the Tandem family, has the same algorithm as the Control IQ. Medtronic 780G, which is their new fangled AID system. The Omnipod 5, the iLet, which just got released several weeks ago, and we'll talk about that. And then the do-it-yourself, or what I like to call open source pumps that have been used for quite some time very effectively. And we're all afraid of them because they're not FDA approved, but in reality, their outcomes data is really good. Next slide. So it's not an artificial pancreas. We're not there yet, getting closer. But there's an insulin pump, a continuous glucose monitor of some point. So with some of them, almost all of them use the Dexcom. The Medtronic doesn't play with anybody else, so they have their own Guardian. And then recently, with the G7s and Freestyle is now connected to the Tandem pump, giving it information to have these algorithms work. So the algorithm can be within the pump, pod, or smartphone and changes the pump's delivery of insulin based on the CGM value and trend. I mean, how cool is that? Next slide. So let's go over each one of them independently. So I think I've started now 1,000 people on the Tandem Control IQ. It's a fabulous algorithm. It's unique in that you can change anything. You can change the basal rate, you can change the insulin to carb ratio, you can change the correction dose, you can't change the target, but you can change everything else with this system. You can actually duplicate. So if we have a kid who comes to school, has not been really active, but all of a sudden starts playing soccer 5 days a week, we can set a whole new rate and the algorithm will work off of that rate. As I mentioned earlier, the insulin pump will coordinate with the Dexcom G6, the G7, or the Freestyle Libre. The pump responds to glucose data from the sensor, changes the basal rate. So the background dose is kind of key for all of these algorithms. Every 5 minutes on every one of these algorithms, the pump is actually getting information directed to it from the sensor. So what happens with the Tandem is it gives correctional insulin every hour beyond a change in basal. So when you think about it, someone's slightly going up, let's say their blood sugar is 155, and they're going up and it looks like they're going to go above 160 in the next 30 minutes. This system will start giving them a little bit more basal. If that's not enough to bring it back down to where the goal is on a tandem, it's 112.5 to 160. It will then give them correctional doses at 60% of the program correction every single hour. It works the other direction as well. So as they're falling in the next 30 minutes, it looks like, oh my gosh, in the next 30 minutes, this individual is going to get to 112.5. It will stop giving them as much insulin, and it will actually suspend as they approach 70 within the next 30 minutes based on the trajectory. Very fascinating stuff. It has a different sleep target, not important for you guys unless you're going on an overnight with them. What is important, however, is the target glucose for exercise mode. So if we have a kid who has PE right after lunch and they're always going low, you can discuss with them and the family, let's turn on exercise mode. And you could do that in 4 out of the 5 insulin pumps, just to know that that sets the target higher. So now instead of trying to gravitate toward these lower numbers, it says everything higher, mostly about 150. For this particular pump, it changes it from 112.5 to 160 to 140 to 160, leaving that lower number with 28 more points of freedom. But you need to set it about an hour before time because, insulin's not really rapid acting. We call it rapid acting, but certainly not. Next slide. Oh, and one other thing, at each one of these pumps, except the iLet, you do have to put in your carbohydrate value. It's a little different with the open source systems, but the other 3 FDA-approved pumps, you have to put in your carbs, except for the iLet. We'll talk about that in a minute. So the Omnipod 5 is the only pump that is totally tubeless, that is used for treating type 1 diabetes. There's a couple others that are treating people with type 2, but the Omnipod 5 is the only one that is treating type 1. The basal rate is determined every 5 minutes as with everything else. The difference with this one is the trajectory is 60 minutes. So if it sees the blood sugars rising, it's going to get over the target, and targets can be, as shown on the bottom of the slide, 110, 120, 130, 140, or 150. And you can set whatever target. The parents, the family can set whatever targets they want. Can be different for different times of the day. For example, they're having a lot of lows at school. They may set a target of 140 at school and 110 at home. The basal rate cannot be changed after the first pod wear. So I, as a practitioner, will actually set their basal rates, the first pod, which I do with all pumps. But then after a pod change of 3 days, the algorithm takes over and you can't change the basal rate at all. So that background dose, kind of like taking Lantus and splitting it into 24 hours, right? You can't change that. You can't change that dose. The pump changes it. You can change everything else, however. It's the only fully programmable FDA-approved patch pump, and it can change insulin to carb ratios, corrections, and targets, and active insulin time. The only thing it can't change is the basal rate. Remember, with the tandem, you can. So that's one of the big differences between the two. In the tandem, it's a trajectory of 30 minutes. In the OP5, a trajectory of 60 minutes. Next slide.
Can I ask you on the pad real quick? Yeah. So it's my understanding that it has to be an automated instead of manual mode in order for that adjustment to take place. Is that correct?
Yes.
Okay.
And that's true. The Omnipod, the Control-IQ, and the Medtronic all have to be in their automated, and you have an opportunity to go from manual to auto. I will tell you, kids do better in auto. Their quality of life is better. They have less low blood sugars. They have less high blood sugars. Their time in range is much better. So we want to keep them in auto as much as we can. But if all goes to hell in a handbasket, and we can't manage them at school, you can call and say, can we turn this on manual? What would you like me to do? Right? But we do want them in auto. But good question. Yes, it has to be in auto.
The other thing I've noticed is when a family changes the pod, it has to be on manual for a short time. Is that pretty universal? Because there's a lot of times where I'll have to switch the mode to automated at school because the
shouldn't
family
have to.
Pod.
Shouldn't have to. It should, as soon as the pod is changed, they can go to auto. What they do have to wait for, however, is if they change the sensor at the same time they're changing the pod. The sensor requires 2 hours of warm-up.
Okay, that's probably what it is then.
Yeah.
It actually won't switch it to automated mode until it reaches a certain amount of time. So that must be what it is the sensor.
That's what it is. Because if it's just a pod change, because remember, sensors change every 10 days. And pods change every 3. So if they're changing at the same time, it's a 2-hour wait. Now, when Omnipod is able to use the G7, which is where Tandem is right now, and it's in FDA, hopefully will happen quickly, it's only a 30-minute wait. But right now it's 2 hours for the G6. So I'm sure that's what you're seeing.
Thank you.
Good question. Next slide, please. Okay, the 780. So Medtronic has had a very bumpy road for those of you that have worked in this field for a while. I mean, technology is my thing. I love it. But they really had a bumpy road. They had a sensor that wasn't super accurate. They still have, to me, a fairly bulky pump, but the algorithm is awesome. So it automates insulin delivery every 5 minutes. It has a target of 100, 110, or 120 as your choice. You can do whatever one you want. The system corrects to 120, kind of to prevent hypoglycemia, right? To not overcorrect. It's interesting because what their claim to fame is if blood sugar is rising more rapidly than you would expect from general life circumstances. In other words, someone forgot to bolus for their meals. I'm sure you have a few teenagers that do that, like 70% of them. Anyway, then it will ramp up the correction dose. So it doesn't just do a standard. It says, ooh, this is going up really, really fast. We're going to give even more. So that's kind of their claim to fame as something different in this system versus the other systems. You can change the insulin to carb ratio. You can change the active insulin time, which means how long do you anticipate once you give insulin that it is staying in the system and still being active. Because as you know, it has, with a shot, it usually has about a 3-hour curve, can be 4, can be 5, but generally 3. You can strengthen it so it becomes every 2 hours. And that's the recommendation from Medtronic. It's interesting because Tandem is actually on a 5-hour window. That's their algorithm. And you can't change the active insulin time, but with a Medtronic, you can. And then you can go to a temporary target. Once again, as I mentioned before, their temporary target you would use for exercise or anytime they're having, bumpy lows for whatever reason. Maybe they exercised a lot the day before. So there is that same exercise target. Remember, for Omnipod, it's 150. For Medtronic, it's 150. And for Tandem, it brings up the bottom number to 140 to 160 instead of 112.5 to 160. So there is a difference, but not a lot. Another thing I should mention is Omnipod is very aggressive when it comes to setting an exercise target because it also cuts their basal rate in half at the same time. I go to multiple camps for kids with diabetes, and they're running around like crazy. I went to 7 last year. And I generally, when they show up, I put them in exercise mode right away so that their target is always higher. If I start seeing that they're high a lot, maybe they're really active at home, we'll take them out of that exercise mode. But that's a very sensible place to be and a very sensible place to be at school. In fact, I think in my idea for the future is that on that medical management plan, that is one of the options for the school nurse, can say, this child has been low a little too much for my comfort. I want to send them to exercise mode because it's still a good target. I mean, if we can average these kids at 150 all the time, they'd be at a 7.2 A1C, which would be amazing. So it's not a bad target, and it would keep them safer. So I'm hoping in the future that's where we go with some of these medical management plans. Next slide. Okay, this one's so interesting. So this is the iLet, just came out. Just started my first patient on him. Quite different than the Tandem 1,000 people I started. But anyway, the iLet is you just put the person's weight in and the pump takes over. Every other pump, as practitioners, we set basal rates, we set insulin to carb ratios, we set correction doses. In many pumps, we set the target. In this, we do nothing. It's very interesting. I work with Peds Endo at the University of Utah, because one of the camps we have once a month, we have a 4-hour for teenagers. Anyway, he said they are so afraid to really let this go And I think the reason is we're so used to manipulating these pumps and saying, oh, Joe is high. I'm going to change his correction dose, or I'm going to change his basal rate. And all of a sudden, we can't do anything. The algorithm does everything. They don't have an exercise mode, which is my complaint about this pump. So you could set a target to 130, thereabouts. It's kind of like a fuzzy number. Their usual target is 120. You can also set a lower than usual, but you can set a higher target, which is a little bit helpful, but not a lot. And so in talking to Stephen Russell, who's one of the big engineer MDs that's worked on this, he said that's coming. So hopefully in the next year, they will have an exercise target and an exercise mode, which he said will be 25% of the normal basal. Remember, I said Omnipod is 50%. So it'll be interesting to see if that comes out and we can use that, because that's what's my biggest fear in kids going to camp is where are they going to be if we can't set this exercise mode. I will tell you, with an N of one, only an N of one, kid at a 4-hour very active camp, his blood sugars were right at 165 the whole time. It was phenomenal. And he was on the island. You give meal announcements. You don't do carb counting. So you say, okay, this is about the carb amount I usually have for breakfast or for lunch or for dinner. And that's what you do. You just say usual, or you can say more or less, but there is no like, I'm eating 32 grams of carbs. There's none of that. It would be, usually I have about 30 for breakfast, so you put in 30. If you have more than that at 150% more, you add 45 grams, you put in more than. So it's a really interesting system. Where we all want to go, that's what I keep saying to the peds endos that are like fearful of doing this or having a camp. I said, it's where we want to be. We want to just plug kids in and they go play and we don't have to do anything. I don't know that we're there yet, but this is the next step. It doesn't have a manual mode. If there's no sensor data, so the Dexcom goes down, falls off, whatever, it'll go to a safe mode. You have to enter finger sticks. You still enter your meals as usual, less than, more than, but the pump after 48 hours will no longer work. So they have to have a syringe extracted from the reservoir and give shots if it's more than 48 hours. Obviously, it's schooled unless you're on a week-long field trip to Yellowstone or something. That's not something you're going to have to be concerned about. After they've been on for 7 days, it's a 72-hour window, but you can't make it work. There's no manual mode. And little is known yet in the real world on how these are going to work. I'm pretty excited about them, but we'll see. It's the only automated insulin delivery system right now that determines 100% of all the insulin dosing. No carb counting, no corrections, no calculated boluses. I mean, how cool is that for kids if this really works well? I'm particularly excited for my teenagers. Okay, what about these do-it-yourselfs that everybody is like scared to death of? In fact, I had a big argument with two of the big peds endos a few years ago at an American Diabetes Association meeting. Here's little Carla arguing with these bigwigs. But I'm like, they said, we can't have these at camp. And I said, oh my gosh, this is what they use at home. This is what they use at school. Their grandparents help use them. I mean, you can't stop. You can't give them another pup all of a sudden. So anyway, it's the standards of care now for American Diabetes Association at camps. They have to let them use what they used at home. So I will tell you that these systems have fabulous outcomes data. They are a little more flexible than anything we have. They basically lead the way. And my perception on them is, had these engineers not put this together before Control-IQ and OP5 and Medtronic 780 and all these systems, we may not even have those yet. It was these people that said, this is ridiculous. The technology is there. We can do this. And they started their own do-it-yourself systems. That's why it's called do-it-yourself. But in reality, it's open source. Anybody can make one. There are no rules because there is no government requirement. There's no regulation because they didn't put it through the government. So it's very interesting. We're very fearful. So I put all these websites. I mean, you could look it up and see how to make one. I don't necessarily ask my patients to do this, but if they're engineers and they're really interested in doing so, I don't say, you can't be in my practice to do that, right? So we have a couple in our practice, not very many, that choose to do this. Next slide. One of the big things that's going to change for you is that the low treatments change. So when you think about it, as they're approaching either at 30 minutes or 60 minutes, they're approaching a low, the insulin is already cut back. So it's already giving them less. The reason we give carbohydrates is because they have too much insulin on board. It's already cut it back. So generally we start with 5 to 8 grams of carbs. I mean, I just do 2 glucose tabs. Sometimes I do 1 at camp and it works great. And I think camp has a lot of similarities to school. Next. Okay, I just want to show you a real quick slide on how to give less insulin. So if you have a Medtronic, you can change the carb ratio, you could change the active insulin climb, you could change the target, you can put it in a second profile, though it doesn't work well for basals, and a target of 150. From the Tandem and the Mobi, which I said is just a little miniature version, you can change the carb ratio, you can change the correction, and you could put it into exercise mode. In the Omnipod, you can change carb ratio, correction, active insulin time, target, and put it into a different target. And the iLet, the only thing you can do is change the target. So just so you know, there is a potential to make it so the pump is less aggressive regardless of what automated insulin pump delivery system you're using. Okay, so safe at school. Research would suggest that this is a great picture. Can you see all the technology? They've all got pumps, sensors. Do you see all that? This was a camp in far north Alaska. We were 7 hours above Fairbanks in dry cabins. It was amazing. 9 teenagers for a week. And I didn't pull all my hair out. It was awesome. And they were all on automated insulin delivery systems. But anyway, more time in range, the gold standard, fewer low glucose readings, and improved quality of life. And I would say I had 1 significant low at night in the 7 days they were with me. And I had a couple lows in the afternoon when we were doing some hiking, but nothing that wasn't treatable by a few glucose tabs. That's the difference in AID. Next. So if you, is that one? Which one came first? Nuts and bolts. You can always revert to manual mode except the iLet. You can always revert to shots if everything else fails. And make sure to have a complete medical management plan. And see this map of Alaska? Last year at an ADA camp in Cooper's Landing, they lost all their electricity for the week. Every one of these systems runs because they can plug it in, right? They had no electricity. The exception to that is really the 780. It will run on batteries, but nothing else will. So they had to go to shots. So they went back to the old days of Lantus and Hubalog for 150 kids. And they survived. Amazing. I mean, God bless the AIDs. I mean, these automated insulin delivery systems are amazing, but they can fail, right? Just like your stove or your oven, your washing machine can fail. So it's always good to have a backup plan. Okay, next slide. And this is just my advertisement. If you want to learn a lot about pumps, if you want to learn about type 1 diabetes, we would love to have you come to one of the camps. There are 120 camps in the United States and 120 international camps if you want to go to Costa Rica or Maldives or wherever. They can always use your help. It will change your life. I have been doing this for 35 to 40 years. And as I mentioned, I go somewhere between 3 and 7 camps, from ski camps to far north camps to surf camps to day camps to overnight camps. Every single time I go, I learn something. It's amazing. Next slide. So these are also camps. There's riding on insulin ski camp, obviously. And this young lady over on the left is on our rock climbing wall at Weber State, where we have a month-to-month camp actually for teenagers, and she's there. Didn't want to climb, and look at her. She's amazing.